Hello, I'm Dr. Rob Scott, the president of Life University, and I'd like to thank the FCLB for this recognition and the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about the future of our profession with my friends and colleagues, and in particular, Federation board members and officers. As described by the FCLB, the purpose of the Janse Lecture is to challenge the status quo. Speakers must envision the future possibilities and encourage the audience of regulators to consider new points of view, new perspectives in their approaches to public protection. The description goes on to say that, like any authentic human relationship, my remarks should provide comfort to the distressed and distress to the comfortable. If the reception to many of my opinions and remarks on social media is any measure of this, I am certain that if nothing else, I can be successful at bringing comfort to the distressed and distress to the comfortable. Let me start by quoting the late comedian Joan Rivers. Can we talk? No, I mean seriously, can we talk without then following up with something derogatory and demeaning to score points or get a laugh at someone else's expense? Can we talk about important issues that repeatedly prevent us from moving forward collectively as a profession? Can we talk in professional, collegial, and respectful venues to clarify opinions and positions, to cut through the rhetoric and the politicization in an increasingly divisive and contemptuous environment that has become so pervasive not only in our profession, but also our nation? Can we talk? I hope so, because right now, in my view, there is only one thing happening in this country that's worth talking about, and we've all seen it explode in a mushroom cloud over the last few years. I'm going to describe it using a mashup, as it were, of two recent works on the current state of our society. Arthur C. Brooks wrote about our culture of contempt, and Peter T. Coleman has just released a book about the toxic polarization that we're seeing play out these days across the entire public arena. I think the single biggest problem facing our profession and our society is the culture of contempt that has been bred by the toxic polarization of nearly every issue that we face. In other words, the middle ground between the polar positions has been paved from both sides with a thick and oily layer of contempt. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer defined contempt as the total and complete sense of worthlessness of another. When spite and disgust meet, it becomes extremely toxic and remarkably unproductive. Everything has become black or white, right or wrong, with no consideration of any position between the polar opposites. That sets up a no man's land or a vast wasteland in the middle ground. Polarization or polarized thinking is known in psychology as cognitive distortion because reality most often exists between the two poles or extremes. It seems to me that the highly repellent quality of the poles we're seeing today is a symptom of what may be the biggest cause of mass cognitive distortion in the history of the world. Why did reaching solutions to the issues in our profession have to become so polarized, so either or, with no opportunity to find resolution on the middle ground, when the middle ground is where most of us and our patients, along with reality, reside? Our professional strategies in recent years appear to be based upon a divide and conquer approach, move forward at all costs and take no prisoners. One chiropractor messaged me saying, "The days of uniformity through diversity are long gone, join us." You know, I simply can't accept that conclusion. For a country as rich in diversity as ours, I don't accept that for our nation, and I most definitely can't accept it for our professional diversity either. If we collectively continue down this path with an unwillingness to engage in this important dialogue, I fear that things will quickly manifest into what the Institute for Alternative Futures called professional civil war. We don't have to look too far into the future to see the silhouettes of opposing soldiers emerging through the fog of our profession's battlefield. This outcome would be extremely unfortunate, not just for the profession, but for our communities and the public that we serve and whom our regulators protect. The good news is that it's avoidable, but only if we can look toward a shared vision for the future. You know, with only 30 years in this profession, I know that I'm just a minor compared to many, but I'm likely a senior to most. I can tell you from my decades of observation that the issues we face today are not new. From the review of chiropractic history, I also can tell you that the same issues have been around for almost as long as the profession, since 1906, when John Howard left the Palmer School with a delegation of students and walked down the Brady Street Hill and started the National School of Chiropractic to teach, as he stated, quote, "chiropractic as it should be taught," end quote. And here we are, over a century later, frankly, pretty much in the same place, arguing over how chiropractic should be taught and practiced. Sure, our 21st century educational experience has much improved. Instructional and practice facilities has improved as well. The profession has been recognized by licensure in all 50 states and many countries around the world. Our research base is expanding. Chiropractic has gained acceptance as a regulated health profession within our healthcare delivery system. These are huge advancements for our young profession, and yet we are still woefully behind in achieving the professional solidarity born of mutual respect and shared understanding. Today, our regulatory boards are charged with the important responsibility of protecting the public, and in so doing, adjudicating over how chiropractors should practice. And all the issues and decision points faced by our regulators today are still informed by the answer to that same old question from a century ago. What does chiropractic, as it should be taught, look like? What are we doing? How do we know? Forget scope of practice for a moment. What are our practice objectives? What is it that chiropractors are doing that sets them apart from other healthcare practitioners? You see, recognizing that chiropractic is composed of three pillars, of philosophy, science, and art, various segments of our profession have chosen to move forward using a singular pillar as a battering ram to knock down the other two pillars instead of standing together with them to advance our ability to provide others with the value, the benefit of our care. More, the one-pillar approach ignores the foundational duty of a profession, establishing governing practices that support the collective, ethical, and equitable determination, definition, and description of the answers to fundamental questions. These questions are basic things like, is chiropractic a separate and distinct healing profession? If so, what is different about our fundamental tenets and model of health? What is the basis for our distinctiveness? What are we doing for our patients that no one else can? It sometimes seems as though we are at a hopeless impasse between our sophomoric present and our future as a mature healthcare profession. That impasse to our future has been created at the juncture of two fundamental and unanswered questions. The first, do we serve primarily as an implement in the conventional healthcare toolbox that delivers therapeutic intervention for pain management? Or the second, are we providing our patients with an alternative choice in approaching their health that complements conventional healthcare? Both, by the way, are perfectly viable paths, but each will traverse a different terrain, require different construction resources to build, different rules of the road to navigate, and different kinds of traffic enforcement to promote public safety as we pave the way toward professional maturity. Another question on which we are at an impasse and have created toxic polarity is this. Is there a neurological basis to the chiropractic adjustment? If there is, then are we unable or just unwilling to operationally define it? An even more fundamental, yet still polarizing issue involves defining the subluxation itself, because the only thing that makes chiropractic a separate and distinct standalone profession is its focus on identifying and reducing spinal subluxation. So instead of defaulting to the denigrating and willfully uninformed position that subluxations don't exist and are pseudoscientific, several examples exist that effectively define subluxation as a neurophysiological chiropractic phenomenon. While certainly not exhaustive, these descriptions appear to meet the necessary requirements for being both plausible and researchable. Are we not willing to cooperatively tackle the issues of subluxation in a meaningful way as opposed to discarding it outright? If not, then I hope and pray that those opposing subluxation are not currently billing Medicare, because frankly, addressing subluxation is the only thing we are paid by Medicare to do. It would be difficult to deny that subluxation has deep historical roots, that it possesses elements of professional identity, provides an interesting and compelling clinical research model, and has important legal and legislative implications in almost all, if not all, 50 states. It's also not hard to deny that after 126 years, it has proved to be a very ineffective word for marketing the profession. It's not a stretch to suggest that the term subluxation has been ineffective in communicating what we do because of our inability to collectively embrace and define the word. Wouldn't it be helpful for us to have a greater agreement on the answers to these questions for the purpose of putting some bumpers on the conversation so that we, as a profession, are at least having the same conversation? I believe that the singular reason we are in the place we are is because we have never learned to talk with one another, but we have excelled in the dubious art of talking at each other. I know this from personal experience over the past 30 years where I have literally lived in both camps within our profession. You see, I spent the greater part of my life and half my early career living in the left side of my brain, some would say just a short distance from my body. Raised and educated with a strong science foundation, graduated from a good chiropractic college who do what they do very well, went into practice and practiced in a way that reflected both my experience with chiropractic as a young active individual and my education. During my chiropractic education, I participated in the World Congress of Chiropractic Students and had a great time. One WCCS conference in particular, held in Bournemouth, is memorable, and I have a photograph from an evening social event. It's a picture captured in time of me and another guy, each with a beer in hand, deep in conversation. He's pointing at me and my mouth is open, saying something in response. I remember the conversation well, because we were talking about innate intelligence. I had just said, with all my left brain wisdom, why don't you just call it homeostasis, because that's what it is. I have no choice but to look back at this picture with both fondness and forgiveness for a time in my younger years when I was speaking with great authority on a topic, as I discover later in my career, that I had no idea of what I was talking about. I had no idea of what I was talking about because I had never been exposed to chiropractic principles and philosophy as anything other than historical footnote or worse, from a point of denigration and superiority. In my view today, this uninformed yet dismissive stance becomes problematic because over time, many schools have adopted this position and educate chiropractic students from a rigidly parochial perspective that isolation often produces. Ayn Rand has a great saying, "It's difficult to talk about complex things, made even more difficult when you don't know what they are." Frankly, many chiropractors react to the mere mention of chiropractic philosophy, not from a position of understanding and appreciating the richness of its context, but rather from a position of responding to the sloganeering often employed by proponents of chiropractic philosophy. Let the power that made the body heal the body, above, down, inside out, turn the power on, and the list goes on and on. The problem with sloganeering is that slogans lack context, do little to promote understanding of the topic, and often distort meaning. While slogans are not an effective interprofessional communication tool, in healthcare, terminology is the coin of the realm, and whoever controls terminology controls the narrative. Therefore, it would appear that at a time when medicine is using and publishing terms like systemic intelligence and developing fields of health neuroscience, it would be at our peril if we as a profession were to dismiss outright the richness of our historical roots. To grow as a profession, we must work together to include our roots in a meaningful way moving forward. While many believe that uniformity through nonconformity is a hopeless task, I still believe, possibly naively, that diversity builds professional strength, and one united profession is best for our patients and the communities we serve. At the risk of paraphrasing B.J. Palmer in The Great Divide, I believe that much can be gained by recognizing that both sides are right in as far as they go. Both are wrong because they're only half right. They ignore the other half. This resulting polarization can be seen everywhere. We've paved the middle ground with contempt, creating an us versus them wasteland in which these issues are not discussed in a productive setting, but rather in siloed echo chambers walled off behind closed doors of social media platforms. This toxic culture is spreading as lobbying efforts and disputes are erupting throughout our profession in attempts to ensure that more evidence-based chiros and more principled chiros are elected to our regulatory boards in order to ensure their respective views are preserved and enforced. This inability to delineate these issues has resulted in confusion and unnecessary hostility directed at our regulatory boards as well as within them, as issues like vitalism and subluxation have been conflated and made synonymous with unethical practice and inappropriate marketing and advertising. And don't get me wrong, these are very important issues to address and regulate. However, there is nothing beyond prejudice and ignorance to equate unethical practice and behavior with the many vitalistic subluxation-based chiropractors honorably serving their communities. Another area where some clear definitions and shared vocabulary could help our regulatory boards in exercising their duties is with regard to evidence-based care. What does evidence-based care even mean in our conversations these days? Personally, I've always defaulted to Sackett's definition, which combines best available evidence, clinical experience, and patient preference. Is that how we're defining it as it relates to establishing regulations and standards of practice? Or has it simply morphed to mean just best available evidence? And what does that mean for standards of practice where there is no or little high-quality research in the form of systematic reviews and RCTs? In such a circumstance, is it acceptable practice? And my favorite, can one not be a vitalistic subluxation-based chiropractor and still be evidence-based and grounded in science? Apparently not until we get some clarity on what it is we are collectively talking about. I only ask these questions because this is the point at which it would appear the polarization between two camps is reaching toxic levels both within our profession and in our relationship with our regulators. What is worse is when regulators or a segment of the profession seek to drive an outcome or an agenda. To achieve their ends, they use strategy of conducting research and systematic reviews of the literature in areas where one doesn't really need a crystal ball or a lot of data analysis to see how things are going to turn out. Or more cynically, spending tens of thousands of dollars to know the outcome and then declare there is no evidence to support a practice. For example, the recent regulation passed in a Canadian jurisdiction that only permits red flag findings as appropriate indications to take an X-ray is a current manifestation of this dubious strategy. It should have come as no surprise to anyone in the profession that the Corso et al. Study would find, quote, no evidence that radiographs used to assess the function or structure of the spine improves patient outcomes, end quote. Yet this study, having been paid for by a regulatory board in contravention of best practices, thereby coming with its own red flag, was nevertheless used as a supporting determinant in passing regulation. A similar red flag play was committed at the Global Summit in 2019 for the purpose of conducting a systematic review of the literature on the efficacy and effectiveness of spinal manipulation on non-musculoskeletal disorders. Much fanfare was made on social media by those selected researchers who were invited to attend this event held in Canada. Again, one questions the merit and frankly the utility of such a study undertaken, knowing full well how few resources have been allocated to study this area. In response to this rather large red flag, however, a handful of researchers who had been invited to this charade withdrew from the process and in response went on to publish what could be best described as a paper of dissension. In January of this year, Gertz, Horowitz, Murphy, and Coulter, all prominent, influential researchers in our profession, published a paper in JMPT called Extrapolating Beyond the Data in a Systematic Review of Spinal Manipulation for Non-Musculoskeletal Disorders, a fall from the summit. While Gertz et al. Clearly identified their three areas of concern regarding the Global Summit's manuscript, they made the following statements that I think would be very practical to all our regulatory agencies. They stated that, quote, a lack of evidence cannot be interpreted as counter-evidence nor used as evidence of falsification or verification, end quote. And then they went on to conclude this important statement, quote, governments, insurers, payers, regulators, educators, and clinicians should avoid using systematic reviews and decisions where the research is insufficient to determine the clinical appropriateness of specific care, end quote. If we are to be an evidence-based profession, we must ensure that in our jurisdictions, hypocritical partisan agendas are not allowed to play out under the guise of research and science. So why is any of this even important? Because we continue to walk in a toxic, polarized wasteland of contempt that we've created in the absence of collectively derived answers to fundamental questions about the nature of our profession. What does our profession offer its consumer? Is it a natural, drug-free approach to health? It wasn't that long ago that I was licensed under the Drugless Practitioners Act of the jurisdiction in which I lived. Is it simply cost-effective management of musculoskeletal disorders? We do that pretty well. If it is these things, then why us, since we clearly aren't the only providers in this space? Why chiropractors? Why would the consumer choose us? I'm reminded of some important marketing principles that I learned many years ago that hold up as well today as they did back then. One in particular stands out from the authors Doug Hall and Jeffrey Stamp, included in their book Meaningful Marketing. They said, quote, the success of a product or profession is directly proportional to the magnitude of its meaningful difference, end quote. That phrase really stands out, the magnitude of its meaningful difference. This fundamental marketing principle begs questions for chiropractic. What is our meaningful difference in the healthcare marketplace? More specifically, what is chiropractic's value proposition? That's an interesting question for us, and the concept of value proposition has been well described through the years in business literature. You create value in one of three ways. First, you create value through price point. We're seeing this strategy emerging in the marketplace with the low cost of entry clinic options that are popping up across the country. We've also seen the outcome of this strategy play out in the retail sector with the big box stores. Just ask your local hardware store, if you can find one, how the price point strategy has worked for them. Seth Godin has termed this kind of price war as a race to the bottom and assures us that there are no real winners in a race to the bottom. Second, you can create value through level of service. We've all experienced this, a restaurant or a hotel where the service is just so exceptional that you go back just to experience it again. And be careful not to confuse satisfaction with service, because they are not one and the same. Service is what we provide, and satisfaction is how the service is received. Patients can be satisfied with the interactions they have with their chiropractor, even if the service has delivered no measurable value. Third, and probably most important, is that you create value by the distinctiveness of your service. What is the distinctiveness of our service? What is it that separates chiropractors from every other health professional that hangs out their shingle to help people with their low back pain and neck pain? What is it that will drive the consumer to reach into their pocket and increasingly spend their discretionary income on what you offer them? These are the questions that drive our value proposition and position our profession in the marketplace of ideas. The answers to these questions have possibly never been more important than they are today. As our communities, as entire countries emerge from this pandemic, one thing's clear. Never has it been more important to focus on promoting self-responsibility in one's health and living healthy lifestyles than it is today. As Americans, we have the dubious honor of being members of one of the sickest populations on the face of the planet. Ironically, even while we are also participants in the most expensive per capita healthcare systems in the world. Right now in this country, every 15 seconds, a child is born suffering the debilitating and often fatal effects of neonatal abstinence syndrome. Through no fault of their own, these babies are born addicted and suffering the withdrawals of a drug or substance addiction passed on to them from an addicted mother. Right now in this country, 1 in 35 children are diagnosed with some level of autistic spectrum disorder, and it's predicted that if this continues at its current trajectory, then by 2050, just 29 years from now, as many as half of the children in this country may be diagnosed with some degree of neurocognitive disorder. And right now in this country, as if the pandemic wasn't bad enough, we remain in the midst of the single biggest drug addiction epidemic in U.S. history. Every single day, on average, opioids are killing more people under the age of 50 than car accidents, cancer, and the height of the AIDS epidemic. So given all of that and the clinically observable value that chiropractors have been delivering to their patients for over 126 years, I'm going to emphasize what I believe are the value proposition questions that we must collectively answer if we want to continue to exist as a profession. What is our value proposition? What service can we provide our patients at a comparatively lower cost? How measurable or replicable are the outcomes of the service we provide? What are we doing for our patients that no other profession can provide? That brings me to patient-centered care, one of the hallmarks of quality healthcare according to the Institute of Medicine. Their definition describes the necessity of a relationship between practitioners and patients, as well as their families, that chiropractors have been modeling so long that I would venture to assert that chiropractic practically invented patient-centered care. Listen to these direct quotes and tell me if you, like I do, feel as though they could have been written about the vast majority of chiropractors you know. They provide care that, quote, establishes a partnership among practitioners, patients, and their families, when appropriate, to ensure that decisions respect patients' wants, needs, and preferences, and the patients have the education and support they need to make decisions and participate in their own care, end quote. Isn't this the perfect example of chiropractic as it should be taught? Isn't this what most chiropractic colleges have been teaching since the beginning? The Institute of Medicine's definition goes on to say that patient-centered care, quote, encompasses qualities of compassion, empathy, and responsiveness to the needs, values, and expressed preferences of the individual patient, end quote. This is the heart of our value of lasting purpose, on which Life University was founded and is reflected in the oath each of us takes when we assume the role of holder of the public trust. And this aspect of patient-centeredness is the heart of what our regulators should be most keenly focused on when acting on their duty to protect the public, and not simply on whether a chiropractor uses low-dose X-ray to affirm findings and rule out visible contraindications to care. Finally, the definition concludes by stating that, quote, the patient-centered approach includes viewing the patient as a unique person rather than focusing strictly on the illness, building a therapeutic alliance based on the patient's and the provider's perspectives, end quote. For those who may not be aware, this aspect of patient-centered care is at the heart of our philosophy of vitalism, which provides the guiding principle that each person, in the absence of interference, is uniquely expressing their optimal potential for health and well-being. It assures us that our patients are far more than their conditions and symptoms, and that we can only work in partnership with our patients and their own body's unique wisdom to address their health and well-being. So in my view, the Institute of Medicine's definition of patient-centered care effectively summarizes the remarkable good chiropractic has done for millions of patients around the world. Before I conclude my remarks, I'd like to take this opportunity to turn our vision to the future with my favorite quote by James Allen, author of As a Man Thinketh. "The greatest accomplishment is but for a moment a dream. The mighty oak sleeps in the acorn, the bird waits in the egg, and in the highest vision of a soul, a waking angel stirs. Dreams are the seedling of realities." The documented value provided to millions of chiropractic patients assures me that despite the nightmare of contempt and toxic polarization we've allowed to invade our dreams as a profession, our uniqueness as a drug-free, safe, and effective healthcare choice remains worthy of safeguarding. I know that each and every one of us has a dream to provide care and hope to the sick and suffering, a dream to provide our communities with a viable choice in their desire for affordable, effective healthcare options. I pray that we can become that mighty oak in which we dream, a mature profession with deep roots and a desire to serve, a strong trunk made up of layer upon layer of growth rings, nurtured by evidence and ethics, capable of supporting the many branches of practice and specialization available to us as a mature profession. I pray that in our maturity, we will be able to maintain the broad and inclusive scope of practice needed to ensure that the highest vision of our collective soul becomes a reality. I pray that a waking angel stirs from the emerging sciences that increasingly suggest mechanisms of action for the observable and clinically documented value that chiropractors have been providing patients for more than a century. And finally, in doing my own part to serve in the answer to that prayer, I promise to be agreeably disagreeable in a more productive and fertile middle ground in which the seedlings of our dream of a mature profession can grow and flourish. I invite each of you to join me there.